The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman James Mitchell took his position outside the iconic black gates. Standing at attention in his red tunic and towering bearskin hat, he prepared for another day of ceremonial duty. The 28-year-old soldier had been part of the Queen's Guard for 3 years, and he knew the rules by heart. Remain motionless, eyes forward, no talking, no smiling, no breaking character under any circumstances. James had always taken pride in his discipline. During his training, instructors had drilled into him the importance of maintaining the dignity and tradition of the Guard. Tourists could shout, make faces, or try every trick in the book, but a true guardsman never wavered. This wasn't just a job. It was a sacred duty that connected him to centuries of British military tradition. The morning started like any other. Crowds of tourists gathered behind the metal barriers, cameras clicking constantly. Children pressed their faces against the railings, pointing at the guards with wide-eyed wonder. Adults posed for selfies, trying to get the perfect shot with the stoic soldiers in the background. James had seen it all before, and he maintained his statue-like composure with practiced ease. Around 10 o'clock, a family approached the gates. A mother and father walked hand in hand with their daughter, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The little girl had bright blonde curls that bounced as she walked, and she wore a tiny red dress that seemed to mirror the color of James's uniform. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity as she took in the grandeur of the palace. The family stopped directly in front of James's position. The parents began taking photos, but the little girl seemed more interested in studying the guard himself. She tilted her head to one side, then the other as if trying to figure out if he was real or some kind of elaborate statue. "Mummy," she whispered loudly, "is he breathing?" Her mother smiled and quietly explained that yes, he was a real person, just doing his very important job of protecting the palace. The little girl nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the seriousness that only children can muster. For several minutes, the family continued their visit. The parents snapped photos and read information from their guidebook, but the little girl never took her eyes off James. She seemed fascinated by his stillness, his perfect posture, and the way his eyes never moved from their forward position. Then something unexpected happened. The little girl stepped closer to the barrier and began to wave at James. Not the casual wave that many tourists gave, but a proper, enthusiastic wave with her whole arm. When he didn't respond, she tried again, this time adding a big smile to her greeting. James felt his resolve being tested. The child's innocent enthusiasm was unlike anything he'd encountered during his time on duty. She wasn't trying to be disruptive or get a reaction for entertainment value. She was simply being kind, offering a genuine greeting to someone she saw as a person deserving of acknowledgement. The little girl tried a different approach. She began to dance, performing what appeared to be a ballet routine she'd probably learned in dance class. She spun in circles, her red dress twirling around her, and ended with an elaborate curtsy directed specifically at James. Her performance was so earnest and heartfelt that several other tourists stopped to watch and smile. Still receiving no response, the child looked disappointed, but not defeated. She thought for a moment, then reached into her small backpack and pulled out something that made James's heart skip a beat. It was a small stuffed bear, brown and well-loved, clearly her favorite toy. The little girl held up the bear and made it wave at James. She created a tiny voice for the toy and began having it talk to the guard. "Hello, Mr. Guard," she made the bear say in a high-pitched voice. "My name is Teddy. Would you like to be friends? I promise I'm very nice, and I know how to share my cookies." The innocence and sweetness of the moment hit James harder than any challenging situation he'd faced in his military career. This wasn't a tourist trying to break his concentration for their own amusement. This was a child offering genuine friendship and kindness to a stranger. The little girl continued her one-sided conversation, making the bear ask questions about the palace, whether James liked his big hat, and if he ever got tired standing so still. Her imagination transformed the moment into something magical, creating an entire friendship between her stuffed animal and the silent guard. Other tourists began to notice the interaction and started filming. But unlike the usual attempts to get guards to react, this felt different. People were drawn to the pure innocence of the child's behavior and the touching one-way conversation she was conducting. James felt something he'd never experienced during his duty hours. The rigid discipline that had been drilled into him began to wage war with his natural human compassion. Every instinct told him to acknowledge this sweet child who was offering nothing but kindness and friendship. The little girl's mother eventually tried to guide her away, explaining that they needed to continue their tour. But the child resisted, not ready to end her newfound friendship. She looked up at James one more time and did something that would change everything. She blew him a kiss. It was such a simple gesture, so pure and innocent, that James felt his carefully maintained composure crack just slightly. For a split second, the corner of his mouth moved upward in what could only be described as the beginning of a smile. The moment lasted only a fraction of a second, but the little girl caught it. Her face lit up with joy as if she'd just witnessed magic. She began jumping up and down, pointing at James and exclaiming to her parents that the nice guard had smiled at her. James quickly regained his composure, returning to his perfectly stoic expression. But something had changed. The brief moment of human connection had reminded him that beneath the uniform and ceremony, he was still a person capable of being moved by simple acts of kindness. The family finally moved on, but not before the little girl gave one final wave and called out, "Goodbye, Mr. Guard. Thank you for smiling at me." Her voice carried such genuine happiness that it touched not only James, but every person who witnessed the exchange. For the rest of his shift, James found himself thinking about the encounter. The little girl's innocent attempt at friendship had pierced through years of military training and reminded him why the work he did mattered. He wasn't just protecting a building or following protocol. He was part of something that brought wonder and joy to people, especially children who saw magic in the pageantry and tradition. Later that evening, when James was back in civilian clothes and off duty, he couldn't stop thinking about the little girl and her stuffed bear. The interaction had been brief, but it had touched something deep within him. He realized that sometimes the most profound moments come from the most unexpected sources, and that maintaining humanity within duty doesn't always mean compromising professionalism. The story of the little girl who made the guards smile would become one that James would carry with him throughout his career. It served as a reminder that behind every uniform is a human being, and sometimes acknowledging that humanity, even for just a moment, can create connections that last a lifetime. Word of the incident eventually spread among James's fellow guards. Rather than criticism for his momentary lapse in protocol, he received understanding from his colleagues. Many shared their own stories of challenging moments when children had tested their resolve with pure innocence and kindness. It became clear that these interactions were part of the job that nobody talked about, but everyone experienced. The little girl had unknowingly given James a gift that day. She had reminded him that rules and tradition, while important, should never completely overshadow our capacity for human connection and compassion. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in rigid adherence to protocol, but in knowing when a small gesture of humanity can make all the difference in the world. The afternoon shift at Windsor Castle brought with it an unexpected challenge that would test every bit of training Guardsman Sarah Thompson had received. At 26, she was one of the few women serving in the ceremonial units, and she took particular pride in proving that she could maintain the same level of discipline and professionalism as her male colleagues. Standing guard at the castle entrance, her red tunic pressed to perfection and her bearskin hat perfectly positioned, Sarah embodied the tradition and dignity of the royal guard. The day had been typical until a school group arrived for their educational tour. About 30 children, aged 7 to 9, followed their teachers through the castle grounds with the controlled excitement that only comes from a special field trip. Their chatter filled the air as they marveled at the ancient stones and towering architecture around them. Sarah noticed one boy in particular who seemed different from the others. While his classmates ran ahead and pointed at various sights, 8-year-old Oliver walked slowly behind the group. He was smaller than the other children, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and glasses that seemed too big for his face. There was something in his demeanor that spoke of shyness and perhaps a touch of sadness. As the group approached Sarah's position, the teacher gathered the children to explain about the guards and their important role in protecting the royal family. The children listened with varying degrees of attention, some fidgeting, others asking rapid-fire questions. Oliver stood at the back of the group, quietly observing everything with intense focus. "Now, children," the teacher explained, "these guards are very special soldiers. They must stand perfectly still and not talk to anyone while they're on duty. It's a very important job that requires great discipline and training." The explanation seemed to fascinate Oliver even more than the other children. He studied Sarah with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying to understand something much deeper than just her role as a guard. While his classmates eventually moved on to other attractions, Oliver lingered, continuing to watch Sarah from a respectful distance. After about 20 minutes, something changed in the boy's expression. His face, which had been marked by curiosity, suddenly crumpled with emotion. Tears began to form in his eyes, and despite his obvious efforts to hold them back, they soon began to flow freely down his cheeks. Sarah noticed the change immediately, but maintained her position and composure as required. However, she couldn't help but feel concerned for the clearly distressed child. Oliver wasn't crying the way children usually do when they're tired or wanting attention. This was something deeper, more heartbreaking. The boy's teacher, busy managing the rest of the group, hadn't noticed Oliver's distress. His classmates were exploring other areas of the castle grounds, leaving him essentially alone with his emotions. Oliver wiped his eyes with his sleeve, but the tears continued to come. What happened next would challenge every rule and regulation Sarah had memorized during her training. Oliver slowly approached her position, stopping just outside the designated boundary that tourists were meant to respect. Through his tears, he began to speak in a voice so soft and broken that Sarah had to strain to hear him. "My daddy was a soldier too," Oliver whispered, his voice catching with emotion. "He had a uniform like yours, but he had to go away for work and he can't come home anymore." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. In that moment, she understood that Oliver wasn't just looking at a ceremonial guard. He was seeing someone who reminded him of his father. The boy's fascination hadn't been casual curiosity, but rather a desperate attempt to feel close to someone who represented the father he had lost. Oliver continued speaking, his words tumbling out between sobs. "Mummy says Daddy is watching over us from heaven now, but I miss him so much. When I saw you standing here so brave and strong, it made me think of him. He used to stand tall like you do." Sarah felt her own eyes beginning to water, but she fought to maintain her composure. Every fiber of her being wanted to comfort this grieving child, to somehow ease the pain that was so clearly overwhelming him. The internal struggle between her duty and her humanity created a tension she had never experienced before. The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. "This is my daddy," he said, holding it up so Sarah could see. Even from her position, she could make out the image of a young man in military uniform, smiling broadly at the camera. The resemblance between father and son was unmistakable. "He was really brave," Oliver continued, his voice growing stronger despite his tears. "Mummy showed me his medals. She says I should be proud of him, and I am, but I just wish he could come back and see me play football. I made the school team, and I wanted to show him my uniform." The child's words created a perfect storm of emotion within Sarah. Here was a boy who had lost his father in service to his country, standing before someone who represented that same commitment and sacrifice. The weight of what Oliver was sharing began to crack her professional facade. Other tourists had begun to notice the interaction. Some started taking photos, perhaps thinking they were witnessing an attempt to get a reaction from the guard. But those who were close enough to hear Oliver's words quickly realized this was something entirely different. A respectful silence began to spread through the immediate area as people understood the gravity of the moment. Oliver stepped even closer, now just inches from the invisible line that separated him from Sarah's position. "I know you can't talk to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I just wanted you to know that my daddy was brave like you. And maybe, if you see him in heaven someday, could you tell him that I'm trying to be brave too?" The request was so innocent, so heartbreaking, and so impossibly touching that Sarah felt her resolve completely crumble. A single tear escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek, despite every bit of training telling her to maintain her composure. Oliver saw the tear immediately. Instead of the triumph that usually accompanied getting a reaction from a guard, his face showed understanding and compassion beyond his years. "It's okay," he said softly. "Sometimes grown-ups need to cry too. Daddy used to cry sometimes when he watched sad movies with Mummy." In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Sarah made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. While maintaining her basic position, she gave Oliver the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was barely noticeable to anyone not paying close attention, but to Oliver, it was everything. The boy's face transformed. The sadness didn't disappear entirely, but it was joined by something else: recognition, comfort, and a sense that his father's memory had been honored by someone who understood the weight of military service. "Thank you," Oliver whispered, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "I think Daddy would like you very much." Just then, Oliver's teacher noticed his absence from the group and hurried over to collect him. When she saw his tear-stained face, her expression immediately shifted to concern. "Oliver, what's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, kneeling down to his level. "Nothing's wrong, Miss Peterson," Oliver replied, wiping his eyes but managing a small smile. "I was just talking to the guard about my daddy. She understood." The teacher looked up at Sarah with a mixture of confusion and gratitude, not fully understanding what had transpired, but recognizing that something meaningful had occurred. She gently guided Oliver back toward the group, but not before he turned one last time to face Sarah. "Goodbye," he said simply. "I'll always remember you." As the school group moved on to continue their tour, Sarah found herself profoundly changed by the encounter. The brief interaction had reminded her why she had chosen military service in the first place, not just for the honor and tradition, but for the connection to something larger than herself, something that sometimes required personal sacrifice for the greater good. Later, when Sarah was relieved of her duty, she found herself thinking about Oliver and his father. The boy's courage in sharing his story, his ability to find comfort in the presence of someone who reminded him of his lost parent, and his mature understanding of her constraints had touched her more deeply than any ceremony or official recognition ever could. The incident would become one of the defining moments of Sarah's military career. It taught her that sometimes the most important part of wearing the uniform isn't the ceremony or the tradition, but the human connections that happen when someone sees in you the values and sacrifices that the uniform represents. Word of the encounter eventually reached Sarah's commanding officers, But rather than facing disciplinary action for her moment of emotional response, she received understanding and even commendation for handling a difficult situation with grace and compassion while maintaining the dignity of her position. Oliver's story served as a powerful reminder to all the guards that their role extended beyond mere ceremony. They were living symbols of service and sacrifice, and sometimes that symbolism could provide comfort and connection to those who needed it most. The little boy had given Sarah a gift that day: the understanding that showing humanity within the constraints of duty wasn't a sign of weakness, but rather the highest form of service. The summer heat was particularly intense on this July afternoon at the Tower of London, where Guardsman Michael Davies stood at his ceremonial post near the Crown Jewels exhibition. At 24, Michael was known among his colleagues for his exceptional discipline and unwavering commitment to protocol. In his 2 years of service, he had never once broken character, earning him respect from both his superiors and fellow guards. Today, however, would challenge that perfect record in the most unexpected way. The tower was busier than usual, filled with families taking advantage of the summer holidays to explore one of London's most historic landmarks. Among the steady stream of visitors, a particularly energetic family caught everyone's attention. The Morrison family had traveled from Australia for their once-in-a-lifetime European vacation, and their 6-year-old twin boys, Jack and Ben, were experiencing everything with the uninhibited enthusiasm that only children possess. From the moment they entered Michael's field of vision, the twins were a whirlwind of energy and curiosity. Identical in appearance but distinctly different in personality, Jack was the more outgoing of the two, while Ben was thoughtful and observant. Both boys wore matching red T-shirts that their mother had bought specifically to complement the guards' uniforms, though she hadn't anticipated just how much attention this detail would attract. Michael first noticed the family when they approached his section of the tower grounds. The parents, Lisa and David Morrison, were trying to manage their excitement while reading from a guidebook about the tower's history. The twins, however, were far more interested in the immediate spectacle of the guards than in centuries-old stories about ravens and royal prisoners. "Look, Ben," Jack exclaimed, pointing directly at Michael. "He's exactly like the guards in our book at home, but he's real." The boys had apparently been preparing for their trip by reading about British traditions, and seeing an actual guard in person was clearly the highlight of their visit so far. They approached Michael's position with the fearless confidence that comes with being 6 years old and having no understanding of military protocol. What happened next would become legendary among the tower's staff and guards. The twins, standing side by side in their matching red shirts, began to mirror Michael's stance. They pulled their shoulders back, lifted their chins, and attempted to stand as still as possible in perfect imitation of the guard they were observing. The sight was both adorable and impressive. Despite their small stature and fidgety nature, the boys were making a genuine effort to replicate Michael's disciplined posture. Other tourists quickly noticed the impromptu performance and began taking photos of the 3 figures standing in formation, 1 professional guard and 2 determined 6-year-olds. For about 5 minutes, the twins maintained their impressive mimicry. Jack occasionally whispered instructions to Ben about keeping his shoulders straight, while Ben would quietly remind Jack not to scratch his nose. Their concentration was remarkable for children their age, and even Michael found himself genuinely impressed by their dedication to the task they had set themselves. Then Jack had what he clearly considered a brilliant idea. "Ben," he whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "we should do our funny walk." Before Ben could respond or their parents could intervene, Jack began performing what could only be described as the most exaggerated version of a military march ever attempted. He lifted his knees impossibly high with each step, swung his arms in wide, theatrical arcs, and added a dramatic head movement that would have made the Ministry of Silly Walks proud. Ben, not to be outdone by his twin, immediately joined in with his own interpretation of ceremonial marching. His version included a slight hop on every other step and a saluting motion that seemed to involve his entire body. The twins marched back and forth in front of Michael's position, their serious expressions contrasting hilariously with their wildly exaggerated movements. The tourists gathered around began to laugh, and even the boys' parents struggled to contain their amusement while trying to maintain some semblance of parental control over the situation. Lisa Morrison attempted to whisper-shout instructions to the boys to calm down, but her own laughter made her efforts less than authoritative. Michael felt his professional composure being tested in a way that no amount of training had prepared him for. The twins weren't trying to mock or disrespect the ceremony. They were genuinely attempting to participate in what they saw as an important and impressive tradition. Their interpretation was wildly off base, but their enthusiasm and sincerity made the performance endearing rather than offensive. Jack suddenly stopped his marching and addressed Michael directly. "Are we doing it right, Mr. Guard?" he asked with complete seriousness. "We've been practicing our marching at home, but Mummy says we're too loud for the apartment." The question was asked with such genuine desire for approval that Michael felt his heart skip a beat. These children weren't performing for laughs or trying to get a reaction. They honestly wanted to know if they were successfully participating in what they perceived as an important military tradition. Ben joined his brother in front of Michael's position and added his own question. "Do you think the Queen would like our marching? We want to be good enough to meet her someday." The innocent ambition in Ben's voice, combined with the earnest expressions on both boys' faces, created a perfect storm of emotion within Michael. Here were two children who saw such value and honor in what he did that they wanted to emulate it, even if their understanding of proper military bearing was somewhat unconventional. What happened next surprised everyone, including Michael himself. Unable to respond verbally, he made a decision that would become the talk of the tower for months to come. While maintaining his basic position, Michael gave the boys the slightest, almost imperceptible thumbs up with his right hand, positioned so that only they could see it. The twins' reaction was immediate and explosive. They high-fived each other with such enthusiasm that Jack nearly lost his balance, then resumed their exaggerated marching with renewed vigor and confidence. Now they had official approval from a real guard, which in their minds elevated their performance to professional status. "Ben, he likes it!" Jack exclaimed, his voice carrying pure joy. "We're really good at being guards!" The boys' celebration was infectious. Their parents gave up any pretense of controlling the situation and simply enjoyed watching their children's moment of triumph. Other tourists began applauding the twins' performance, and several started taking videos of what had become an impromptu entertainment show. Encouraged by their success, the twins decided to expand their repertoire. They began attempting to synchronize their movements, creating what they believed was a proper ceremonial changing of the guard. Jack would march to one side of Michael's position while Ben marched to the other. Then they would meet in the middle for an elaborate saluting exchange that involved far too much arm movement and several unnecessary bows. Michael found himself in the unprecedented situation of trying to maintain military bearing while suppressing what threatened to become uncontrollable laughter. The boys' performance was so earnest and enthusiastic that it transcended any concerns about protocol or propriety. They had transformed his ceremonial post into a stage for pure, innocent joy. The situation reached its climax when Jack decided to add a soundtrack to their performance. He began humming what he thought was military music, but which sounded more like a combination of the national anthem and a nursery rhyme. Ben immediately joined in, creating a harmony that was neither musical nor recognizable, but was delivered with such conviction that it somehow worked. At this point, Michael's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. A smile began to form at the corner of his mouth, and despite every bit of training telling him to maintain his stoic expression, the smile grew until it was unmistakably visible to anyone paying attention. The twins noticed immediately and interpreted his smile as the highest possible approval of their performance. They took a synchronized bow, which somehow turned into a tumbling display when Ben lost his balance and knocked into Jack. Both boys ended up in a giggling heap on the ground, their serious military impression completely abandoned in favor of 6-year-old silliness. "Mummy! Look!" Jack called out as he untangled himself from his brother. "The guard likes our show. We made him smile." Their mother approached with a mixture of embarrassment and pride, apologizing to Michael for any disruption while clearly delighted by her son's creativity and confidence. Their father was busy taking photos and videos, documenting what would undoubtedly become a treasured family memory. "Boys," Lisa Morrison said, "I think it's time to let the nice guard get back to his important work." But before the family could move on, Ben had one more surprise. He approached Michael's position and, with the solemnity of a military ceremony, placed a small toy soldier at the base of the post where the guard was stationed. "This is for you," Ben said quietly. "He can keep you company when there aren't any kids around to march with you." The gesture was so unexpected and touching that Michael felt his eyes water slightly. The little plastic soldier, probably worth less than £1, represented something far more valuable. A child's recognition that standing alone on duty might sometimes be lonely, and his desire to provide comfort to someone he saw as deserving of friendship. Jack added his own contribution to the moment. "When we go back to Australia, we're going to tell everyone about the best guard in London," he announced. "And we're going to practice our marching some more, so maybe next time we visit, we can be even better." As the Morrison family finally moved on to continue their tour, both boys turned back multiple times to wave at Michael. Each wave accompanied by an attempted salute that bore no resemblance to any official military gesture, but conveyed respect and affection nonetheless. For the remainder of his shift, Michael found himself periodically glancing down at the small toy soldier that Ben had left behind. The simple gift served as a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful recognition comes not from official ceremonies or commendations, but from the innocent appreciation of children who see something admirable in what you do and want to be part of it. The story of Michael and the Australian twins quickly spread throughout the tower's guard contingent and staff. Rather than facing any negative consequences for his break in composure, Michael received good-natured ribbing from his colleagues and genuine appreciation from his superiors for handling an unusual situation with grace and warmth. The incident became part of Tower of London folklore, often shared with new guards as an example of how to balance protocol with humanity. It served as a reminder that while maintaining discipline and tradition is crucial, recognizing and encouraging the innocent enthusiasm of children who see honor in military service is equally important. Years later, Michael would still keep the small toy soldier with him, a tangible reminder of the day when 2 6-year-old boys from Australia taught him that sometimes the greatest victories come not from perfect adherence to rules, but from knowing when to let joy and human connection take precedence over protocol. The twins had given him a gift that day, the understanding that inspiring the next generation's respect for service and tradition sometimes requires showing them that the people in uniform are human beings capable of appreciating their enthusiasm and returning their affection. The memory of Jack and Ben's exaggerated marching, their earnest questions about proper form, and their genuine desire to participate in something they saw as honorable would stay with Michael throughout his military career, serving as a source of joy and motivation whenever the demands of duty felt particularly challenging.